10 years ago, he vanished without a word. No goodbye, no explanation, no trace. She buried him in the graveyard of her heart and rebuilt her life from the wreckage he left behind. Now, inside the cold fluorescent corridors of Incheon Airport, Park Do-hyun is standing 20 feet away, and the boy walking beside her has his jaw, his eye, his silence. Do-hyun's chest stops working, because that child is 9 years old, and 9 years ago, Kamari Omandi was pregnant and completely alone. He never knew, she never told him, and now there is no running from the truth. If this story already has its hooks in you, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and follow so you don't miss a single second of what happens next. This one goes all the way to the end. The airport smelled like recycled air and departure. That particular mixture of jet fuel and anxiety that settled into the lungs and refused to leave. Park Do-hyun moved through the international arrivals terminal the way he moved through most spaces in his life. Deliberately, quietly, with two men trailing him at a distance, close enough to respond and far enough to be mistaken for strangers. He wore a dark charcoal suit with no tie, collar open at the throat, and carried nothing in his hands. Men like him didn't carry their own luggage. Men like him didn't carry anything they weren't willing to use as a weapon. He was in the airport for 40 minutes of unavoidable business. A brief meeting with a contact arriving from Tokyo, something that couldn't be handled over the phone because phones left records and records left graves. The meeting would take 8 minutes. He would be back in his car before the hour turned. That was the plan. Plans had a way of dying in his presence. He was passing through the main arrivals hall when he saw her. Not immediately, not all at once. It happened the way dangerous things always happen to him. Gradually, then with complete and total devastation. First, he registered the coat. Deep green wool, the kind of color that didn't belong in the gray of a Korean winter, but wore it without apology. Then the posture. Straight-backed, composed. The posture of someone who had trained herself not to look tired, even when she was exhausted down to her marrow. Then the profile. The angle of her jaw. The way she turned her head with that specific impatience, scanning the arrivals board with eyes that missed nothing. His feet stopped moving. Behind him, one of his men, June, the younger one, nearly walked into his back. "Sir?" Do-hyun didn't answer. Kamari Omandi was standing at the edge of the arrivals gate 30 feet away, and she was exactly the same and completely different, and the sight of her hit him somewhere below the ribs with the force of something he had no clinical word for. He had spent 10 years constructing a version of himself that did not flinch. He flinched. She was on her phone, half listening to whoever was speaking, her free hand resting on the shoulder of the child standing beside her. The child. Do-hyun's gaze dropped. The boy was maybe 8 or 9 years old, slight but not small, with the kind of stillness in him that children either had naturally or learned from necessity. He was watching the arrivals board with complete focus, tracking something, counting something in his head. And even from 30 feet away, even through the crowd and the noise and the years, Do-hyun felt the bottom of his world tilt sideways, because the boy's jaw was his jaw. The angle of it, the quiet severity, the way he held his mouth, not quite closed, not quite open, like he was composing a sentence before he allowed himself to speak it. Do-hyun had seen that expression in mirrors for 38 years. He stood completely still in the middle of the arrivals hall, while travelers moved around him like a river splitting around stone. June said something again. Do-hyun couldn't hear it. He was doing the arithmetic without wanting to, the brutal, simple arithmetic. The boy was 9, maybe just turned 9, and the last time he had seen Kamari Omandi was 10 years and 4 months ago in Nairobi, in her apartment above the bookshop on Kimathi Street, the night before everything collapsed. The night he chose to disappear. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. The Tokyo contact, the 8-minute meeting. All of it felt very far away and entirely irrelevant. Kamari ended her call and crouched down to the boy's level, pointing at something on the arrivals board, explaining something in a low voice. The boy nodded once, that single decisive nod, exactly the way Do-hyun had nodded at men across tables in rooms where the wrong answer ended careers and sometimes lives. The gesture was so specific, so inherited, that Do-hyun's throat closed. The boy said something back. Kamari smiled, brief tired, genuine, and straightened up. And then she turned, and she saw him. The smile didn't die slowly. It didn't fade or flicker. It simply stopped, like a power cut, complete and instantaneous. The color didn't leave her face exactly, but something animated withdrew from it, and for 3 full seconds she stood motionless with her phone still raised and her eyes locked on his across 30 feet of airport floor. Do-hyun didn't move. He wasn't sure he was capable of it. Kamari lowered her phone slowly. She said something to the boy without looking at him, a quiet instruction, her eyes never leaving Do-hyun. And the boy turned and looked directly at Do-hyun with an expression of absolute frank curiosity, the way children look at things that frighten their parents, and the resemblance at that range, with the boy's face turned full toward him, was so overwhelming that Do-hyun had to consciously work to keep his expression neutral. He failed. For the first time in a very long time, he failed. Kamari walked toward him. She walked the way she always had, deliberate, unhurried, like she was deciding with every step whether this was worth her time and concluding that it was going to cost him something regardless. The boy stayed where he was, watching. Do-hyun noticed that the child hadn't been told to stay back in a frightened way. He'd been told in the way you tell someone you trust to hold a position. She stopped 6 feet from him. The 6 feet felt like architecture. Do-hyun. Her voice was exactly the same, lower now, maybe. Controlled in a different way, not the control of someone managing nervousness, but the control of someone who had processed this scenario in their head enough times that the actual event was almost administrative. Kamari. His own voice came out level. That much he could do. She looked at him for a long moment, then, "When did you get to Korea?" "I live here." "I know that." A pause. "I meant the airport." "An hour ago." She nodded slowly like that was data she was filing. Her eyes moved over him. The suit, the men at a distance, the way the crowd gave him unconscious clearance. And he could see her reading it, cataloging it, the lawyer's mind organizing evidence into an argument she wasn't ready to make yet. "You look the same," she said finally, not a compliment, not an accusation. Observation. "You look—" He stopped. "Don't." Her voice was quiet and absolute. He didn't. She glanced back at the boy who was watching them with that unsettling stillness. Then she looked back at Do-hyun, and for the first time something moved behind her eyes that wasn't control. Something older and raw, and not entirely resolved. "His name is Jabari," she said. "He's 9. The word 9 landed in Do-hyun's chest like a coal. "He's mine," Do-hyun said. It wasn't a question. He was incapable of pretending it was a question. Kamari held his gaze for a very long 3 seconds. "He's mine," she said. "He has always been mine. He will always be mine." Kamari, "We have a flight to catch." She took a step back. "We're in Seoul for 3 weeks. I have a case. This isn't—" She pressed her mouth closed, reorganized. "This was an airport. This was accidental. This doesn't have to become anything. He's my son." The words sat between them in the airport noise, and she looked at him with something that was not hatred. Hatred would have been simpler, and said, "Don't say that like it earns you something," and turned and walked back to the boy. Do-hyun watched her take Jabari's hand and guide him toward the exit without looking back. The boy looked back once, over his shoulder, with those eyes, his eyes, and held Do-hyun's gaze for exactly as long as a 9-year-old who has grown up without a father looks at a stranger he doesn't understand yet. Then they were gone through the glass doors and into the pale Korean morning. Do-hyun stood in the middle of Incheon Airport while travelers moved around him, and June said his name twice more, and somewhere a phone was still buzzing with a meeting he was no longer going to attend, and he stood there and understood with complete clarity that his life had just changed in a way that no amount of power or money or carefully maintained violence could reverse. He had a son, and for the first time in 10 years, the man who controlled a significant portion of Seoul's criminal architecture felt something he recognized, distantly and with profound discomfort, as fear. The Shilla was the kind of hotel that didn't advertise itself to people who needed to ask about the price. Kamari had been placed there by the International Rights Organization funding her Seoul case. The kind of arrangement that came with a car service and a per diem, and the unspoken expectation that she would work 18 hours a day and not complain about any of it. She didn't. Complaining wasn't in her vocabulary. The suite was large enough that Jabari had his own room, which he immediately claimed by spreading his school materials across the desk, with the systematic territoriality of a child who had learned early that space was not guaranteed and therefore should be organized and defended. Kamari stood in the connecting doorway and watched him sort his notebooks, and thought about a man in a charcoal suit standing motionless in an airport arrivals hall. "Mom," she blinked. Jabari was looking at her with the expression she privately called his assessment face, the one that meant he was constructing a theory about her emotional state and deciding whether to share it. "I'm fine," she said before he could ask. "You didn't eat on the plane." "I ate." "The crackers aren't eating." She almost smiled. Almost. "Get your tablet set up. We have to figure out your school schedule for the next 3 weeks. Jabari turned back to his desk but didn't drop the subject. He never dropped subjects. That was the other thing. He held on to threads with a patience that unnerved adults and exhausted her in the specific way that admiration and worry occupied the same space. "Who was that man at the airport?" he said, very casually, the casual of someone who had been sitting on the question for an hour. "Someone I used to know." "Before me?" "Yes." He looked at me weird. A pause. Not bad weird, like he was calculating something. Kamari was quiet for a moment. "Get your tablet set up, baby." Jabari did. He didn't ask again that night, but she knew he would. He always came back to the unanswered things, patient as water finding its way through stone, and she had perhaps 3 weeks before he worked it out himself. Her son was not a child who required information to be volunteered. He required it to be withheld poorly, and then he would find it himself. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the city of Seoul spread out through the floor-to-ceiling window and thought about what Do-hyun's face had looked like when she said 9. She'd spent years preparing for the possibility of this conversation, drafting versions of it, deciding what she would and wouldn't say. She was a lawyer. She prepared. But preparation, she was discovering for the second time in her life, was an entirely inadequate defense against Park Do-hyun standing 6 feet in front of her with that devastated stillness in his face that she remembered from the very first time she understood he was not a simple man. She opened her laptop and pulled up the case files. Human trafficking, a network operating between Eastern Europe, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. 3 prosecutorial dead ends, 2 witnesses who had recanted under pressure, and a paper trail that disappeared into a series of shell companies registered in jurisdictions that did not cooperate with international courts. Her job for the next 3 weeks was to reconstruct enough of that trail to hand to South Korean prosecutors, enough to make an arrest that would hold. It was the kind of work that attracted attention from people who didn't want the trail reconstructed. She already had 2 emails she was choosing not to think about before bed. She worked until midnight, listening to the muffled sounds of Jabari's tablet through the wall, and then his silence as he fell asleep, and told herself that the man in the airport was a complication she would handle with the same methodical discipline she applied to everything else. She had been lying to herself since Nairobi. She was very good at it. Do-hyun's office occupied the top 2 floors of a building in Gangnam that officially belonged to a real estate investment firm with a spotless record and an annual charity gala attended by politicians. The real business happened in the lower of the 2 floors, in a room with no windows and very good soundproofing, where Do-hyun sat at the head of a table and listened to people tell him things they would rather have kept to themselves. He was there at 9 in the morning, having not slept, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and June standing near the door, looking professionally concerned. On the table in front of Do-hyun was a single sheet of paper with a name on it, Kamari Oman-D, 34, barrister, currently retained by the Geneva-based International Human Rights Collective on a case involving a trafficking network with ties to a Russian syndicate operating in Seoul. He'd had the sheet on his desk within 2 hours of leaving the airport. That was what his operation was, well, not primarily violence, though violence was available and was used when necessary, but information. He knew things before other people knew he knew them, and that asymmetry was the actual foundation of his power. Violence was just the enforcement mechanism. He read the sheet twice and then sat with it. She was here for 3 weeks. She was working a case that intersected, at multiple points he could already identify, with organizations that fell within his sphere. The trafficking network she was investigating had paid protection money to two of his sub-lieutenants 18 months ago, before Do Hyun had ordered that revenue stream shut down. There were connections, complicated ones. None of that was what occupied his mind. What occupied his mind was a 9-year-old boy with his jaw and his eyes and his silence, standing in an arrivals hall holding his mother's hand and looking at a stranger with a child's uncalibrated instinct for significance. Do Hyun pushed back from the table and walked to the window. Seoul in the morning was gray and relentless and enormous, the kind of city that processed human beings through its machinery without pausing to register their individual weight. He had grown up in this city. He had learned to be what he was in this city. He had come home to this city 10 years ago at 28 years old, still carrying the smell of a Nairobi apartment and the knowledge that he was leaving something behind that he would not be able to replace, and he had locked that knowledge in a room inside himself and never opened the door. The door was open now. He had grown up understanding two truths: that the Park family bled for its name and that the name required a specific kind of man to carry it forward. His father had been that man. When his father was killed, ambushed, 3 men, a street in Apgujeong that Do Hyun still couldn't drive down without his jaw tightening, Do Hyun had been called home to be that man instead. There had been no discussion, no choice presented. His father's most trusted lieutenant, a man named Han Seong-jae, who was 60 years old and had the eyes of something that had survived too many winters, had flown to Nairobi personally to deliver the news and the expectation simultaneously. "You are the heir. Come home. Come home now." Do Hyun had been 28 and in love and completely unequipped for what was being asked of him. He had told himself, in the 3 hours between Han's arrival and his departure, that he was protecting Kamari, that bringing her into this world would destroy her, that disappearing was an act of mercy rather than cowardice. He had been lying to himself for 10 years. He was aware of this. The awareness did not make the lie any more comfortable to carry. He turned back to the table. "Find out where she's staying." June hesitated. "Sir, I already know she's at the Shilla. I want the room number and her schedule for the next 3 weeks." June nodded and left without further comment. Do Hyun sat back down and looked at the sheet of paper again and thought about what Kamari had said. "He's mine. He has always been mine." She was right. That was the thing he was going to have to carry. She was entirely right. He had made his choices, all of them, and Kamari Omandi had absorbed the consequences of every single one while raising a child alone in Nairobi and building a legal career from the ground up and becoming the kind of woman who walked through international airports with the posture of someone who had long since stopped waiting to be rescued. She had built herself a life without him and built their son into a person without him, and she was right to say what she'd said. It didn't change what he knew. Jabari was his son, and Do Hyun was whatever else was true about him, whatever accounting the universe was eventually going to make of his choices. Not the kind of man who walked away from that. Not again. He had already walked away once. He understood now, with the kind of clarity that only comes when time has finished doing its work, that it had been the worst thing he'd ever done. Worse than the violence, worse than the inheritance he'd accepted, worse than all the specific and nameable acts of a life spent in the company of men who solved problems with finality. The worst thing he had ever done was leave a woman who loved him pregnant and alone in a city on the other side of the world. He was going to have to find a way to live with that. He was also going to have to find a way past it. The law offices of the Human Rights Collective's Seoul affiliate were located in a mid-rise in Seocho, 3 floors of open-plan desks and conference rooms with glass walls and the specific fluorescent exhaustion of people doing work they believed in for money that didn't adequately reflect that belief. Kamari arrived at 8:30, which was 30 minutes after she was expected and 40 minutes before most of her new colleagues, and claimed a desk by the window and started reading. The case was called the Meridian File internally, though it had no official title because it was not yet an official case. What it was currently was 3 years of investigative groundwork assembled by a loose coalition of lawyers, journalists, and former law enforcement personnel across 4 countries, bundled into a folder that ran to nearly 800 pages and constituted the most comprehensive existing documentation of a trafficking operation that had processed an estimated 4,000 people through its network over 6 years. 4,000 people. Kamari made herself hold that number. She made herself hold it because, in her experience, the greatest occupational hazard of this work was the tendency to process human beings into data points, and she refused to let the abstraction happen. 4,000 people. 4,000 individuals who had names and families and specific fears and specific moments when they understood that the thing being done to them was being done and could not be stopped. 4,000. She was here to give that number a consequence. The specific angle she was working was a series of financial transactions routed through Korean shell companies, front businesses, most of them legitimate on paper, that had been used to launder proceeds. If she could document enough of the chain, the Korean prosecutors could use it to make a case under financial crime statutes, even if the direct trafficking evidence was too contaminated by witness recantations to hold. It was a side door. It was the kind of approach you used when the front door had been welded shut. By 10 o'clock, she had filled 4 pages of a legal pad with notes and connections and the specific frustrations of a paper trail that kept terminating at the same 2 shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. She needed access to the Korean financial records. She needed a cooperative contact inside the prosecutor's office. She needed about 3 things she didn't currently have. Her phone rang. Unknown number, Korean. She considered not answering. Then she answered because she always answered unknown numbers on active cases. Kamari Omandi. A pause. You changed your number. Do-hyun's voice was the same. Lower than she remembered, maybe. But the texture of it, that specific quality of someone who spoke rarely, and therefore precisely, was exactly the same, and something in her chest did a thing she was going to refuse to categorize. How did you get this number? I have resources. A pause. I'd like to meet. No. Kamari. I'm at work. I know. I'm not asking you to stop working. I'm asking for 30 minutes, coffee, somewhere public. I won't. She heard him stop himself. I'll behave. That's a concerning thing to have to specify. A silence that was almost something. You're right. I'm sorry. Another silence. I need to see you, not... It's not about the airport. It's not about pressuring you. There are things you need to know about your case. She went still. My case. The Meridian Network. His voice was completely level. You're 3 weeks in Seoul trying to reconstruct a financial trail. I know things that would save you most of those 3 weeks. Kamari stared at her legal pad and the frustrating terminated trail and thought about what it meant that Park Do-hyun knew the name Meridian Network. Why would you know anything about a human trafficking operation? Because I know everything that happens in this city. A pause. And because 18 months ago, 2 men who worked for me accepted money from that network without my authorization. When I found out, I shut it down and returned the money. Another pause. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to sit across from me for 30 minutes and decide for yourself what the information is worth. Kamari was quiet. There's a cafe on Gil, he said. Neutral ground. Nice enough that a scene would be embarrassing. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. She didn't say yes. I'll think about it. She ended the call before he could say anything else. She sat for a moment with her hand on the phone and her legal pad in front of her, and the weight of what she was holding in her chest. Not the conversation, not the information he dangled, but the voice. The voice that sounded like 10 years ago in a way she was not prepared for, and had no appropriate professional framework to process. She turned back to the dead-end financial trail. She was there at 8 o'clock the next morning. The cafe was exactly as described. A narrow shop house on the tree-lined street with good light and enough ambient noise to make it difficult to be overheard. Do-hyun was already there when she arrived, seated with his back to the wall at a corner table, with a coffee in front of him. He wasn't drinking, and the kind of composed attentiveness that she recognized now as the watchfulness of a man who was always calculating threat levels in any room he entered. He stood when he saw her. She noticed that. He'd always done it. Stood when she entered a room, not performatively, just automatically, like it was a setting that ran beneath his conscious behavior. She sat down across from him. A server materialized and she ordered black coffee and the server disappeared again. You came, he said. I almost didn't. I know. He looked at her with that directness he'd always had, Not aggressive, just unfiltered, like social lubrication was a layer he'd never learned to install. How is he, Jabari? We're not starting there. Okay. He accepted it without resistance. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, 4 pages she could see, dense with what looked like financial data, and placed it on the table between them. The 2 shell companies you keep dead-ending at, Crestline Holdings and Meridian Pacific. They have a third entity, a Korean company called Sung-On Logistics that isn't visible from the international filings because it was registered under a nominee directorship. That's where the money actually lands. Kamari looked at the document without touching it. How do you know what I'm dead-ending at? I have a source inside the prosecutor's office. That's corruption. That's information management. He held her gaze. The source tells me things. I haven't used it to compromise your investigation. I used it to understand it. That's a distinction that won't hold up in court. We're not in court. She looked at him for a long moment. If I take this document, it's clean. The financial data came from a licensed private investigation firm. The sourcing is documented. You can use it. He paused. I'm not trying to contaminate your work, Kamari. I'm trying to help. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because the network you're investigating has done things in this city that He stopped. Started again. Because 4,000 people is a number that doesn't sit right with me, regardless of what else I am. What are you? She said. Exactly. What are you? The server set down her coffee. Neither of them looked at it. I think you already know, he said. You're a lawyer. You've been in Seoul 24 hours and you've been running my name. She hadn't confirmed that, but she didn't deny it either, and he read the silence accurately. I control a significant portion of the informal economy in this city, he said. Protection, finance, certain goods and services that operate outside legal frameworks. I inherited it. I've maintained it. I've tried to... A slight pause. I've tried to run it in ways that cause less damage than the alternatives. That's a remarkable way to describe organized crime. Yes, he said simply. It is. Kamari picked up the document. She read the first page. The financial data was exactly as he'd described. Specific, clean, documented. If Sung-An Logistics was real, and the paper trail connected to it the way this document suggested, it was the side door she'd been looking for. It would save her weeks. She folded it and put it in her bag. Thank you, she said. Then, because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving things unresolved, I didn't tell you about Jabari because I didn't know how to find you, and then because I decided I didn't want to. She met his eyes. Both of those things are true simultaneously. I know, he said. You don't get to be angry about it. I'm not angry. He looked at her steadily. I had choices. I made the wrong ones. I've known that for 10 years. Something moved in his face. Brief, controlled, genuine. He looks like me. He thinks like you, she said before she could stop herself. It's more unsettling. Something in his expression, the first fully unguarded thing she'd seen since the airport, and then it was gone, locked back behind the composure. I want to know him, he said. I'm not making demands. I'm not issuing ultimatums. I'm telling you what's true. I want to know my son. Kamari looked at him across the table in the cafe on Garosugil with the morning light coming through the window and said, Then you're going to have to earn that, one day at a time. No promises, no guarantees. She picked up her coffee. And you're going to have to be honest with me, all of it. No more information management. Do-hyun nodded once, that decisive nod, exactly like Jabari's. She looked away from it and drank her coffee and told herself that what she was feeling was not the beginning of anything. It was the processing of something old and incompletely resolved, and it would pass, and she was a disciplined woman with a difficult case and a 9-year-old son to protect, and she was absolutely not sitting in a cafe in Seoul feeling the walls she'd spent a decade building develop structural problems. She was not. Jabari met Do-hyun on day 4. It wasn't planned. That was the thing Kamari would return to afterward. The way it happened without ceremony, without preparation, without the careful scaffolding she'd intended to construct around it. They were in the hotel lobby on their way to the National Museum, A Sunday arranged around Jabari's insistence that he intended to look at the Silla dynasty artifacts, because Jabari had been reading about Korean history on the plane and had produced opinions about it that he was now committed to verifying against primary evidence. He was that kind of child. Do-hyun was in the lobby, not waiting, or not obviously waiting, though later Kamari understood that the coincidence was not entirely accidental. He was speaking with someone at the concierge desk, or had been, and when they emerged from the elevator he turned and saw them, and in the 3 seconds before Kamari could intervene, Jabari saw him and stopped. "That's the man from the airport," Jabari said. "Conversational, factual." "Yes," Kamari said. "Do you know him?" "Yes." Jabari considered this. Then he walked directly toward Do-hyun with the purposefulness of a 9-year-old who had decided something. Kamari kept pace, her stomach tightening with the specific dread of uncontrolled situations. Do-hyun crouched down to Jabari's level when the boy was 3 feet away. It was the right instinct. Not looming, not condescending, just meeting him where he was. And Kamari noticed it and hated that she noticed it. "Hi," Jabari said. "Hi," Do-hyun said. "I'm Jabari." "I know." A pause. "I'm Do-hyun." Jabari examined him with the frank, appraising look he applied to most new information. "My mom knows you from before." "Yes." "From Kenya?" "Yes." Do-hyun's voice was steady. Kamari could see the effort it was costing him, could see in the set of his jaw and the careful control of his breathing that this was probably the most difficult thing he had done in a long time, and she was not going to feel sympathy for that. She was absolutely not. "She said you used to know each other," Jabari said. "That's right." "Are you still friends?" Do-hyun looked up at Kamari briefly, a question in it, or a request, and then back at Jabari. "I think we're working on it," he said. Jabari considered this answer with appropriate seriousness and apparently found it acceptable. "We're going to the National Museum," he said, "to look at Silla dynasty artifacts. Do you know about the Silla dynasty?" Something almost happened in Do-hyun's face. Almost. "I know a little." "I know quite a lot," Jabari said, without arrogance, just as accurate reporting. "My mom doesn't know very much, but she's interested in learning." "Jabari," Kamari said. "It's factually true," Jabari told Do-hyun confidentially. Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. Then, "Would it be all right if I came along? To the museum?" He looked up at Kamari again. This time the question was entirely for her. Kamari looked at her 9-year-old son, who was already nodding with decisive enthusiasm, and at the man crouching in front of him who had her son's jaw in her son's eyes, and was looking at her with an expression that had nothing practiced in it, and she thought about what it meant to be a disciplined woman who had stopped needing anyone, and said, "Fine, 1 hour." It was 3 hours. Jabari had a great deal to say about the Silla dynasty. The weeks found a rhythm that Kamari hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite dismantle once it had established itself. Mornings she worked. Afternoons Jabari had a tutor arranged by the hotel for his schoolwork, and sometimes, not every day, not on any schedule she had agreed to, but more days than not, Do-hyun appeared. He was careful about it. She had to give him that. He didn't push, he didn't manipulate. He showed up with the consistency of someone who understood that trust was rebuilt incrementally or not at all. And he met Jabari's endless questions about Korea, about martial arts, about the specific mechanics of how things worked, with a patience that she was not prepared for and could not dismiss. When Jabari asked to be taught something, Do-hyun taught him. Basic moves, how to fall without hurting yourself, how to stand in a way that absorbed force. And Jabari absorbed it with the specific attentiveness of a child who had found a frequency he could receive clearly. She watched them in the hotel's small courtyard one afternoon, Do-hyun crouching behind Jabari and adjusting his stance, Jabari listening with his whole body the way he listened when he had decided something was important, and she sat on a bench with her case files in her hands and told herself she was watching for Jabari's sake and not for any other reason. The evidence she was building was moving. The Sung'an logistics lead had opened into 3 more entities and a set of bank transfers that the Korean prosecutors were, cautiously, starting to treat as viable. She was getting somewhere. She was also getting threatening emails, which she had reported to the collective and had not mentioned to Do-hyun, and which she was handling with the particular calm of someone who had worked enough dangerous cases to know when a threat was rhetorical and when it had operational intent. These emails were starting to feel like the second kind. She had also been running Do-hyun's name. Not formally, nothing she could use, but through contacts and networks and the particular informal infrastructure of people who traded in information about powerful men. What came back was not reassuring and was not surprising and was more complicated than either. He was what he said he was. He ran what he said he ran. The violence attributed to him was real, specific, and in several documented instances had been directed at people doing worse things than he was, which was not an exoneration, but was at least a context. He had also, 18 months ago, genuinely and completely shut down any association between his organization and the trafficking network she was investigating, and had in 2 documented cases actively obstructed that network's operations in Seoul. She couldn't decide what to do with that. She kept filing it under incomplete and moving forward. On the Tuesday of their second week, Jabari looked up from dinner in the hotel restaurant and said, with complete unpreambled frankness, "Is Do-hyun my father?" Kamari set down her chopsticks. Jabari waited. He was very good at waiting. She had prepared for this. She had the version she was going to deliver. Measured, age-appropriate, emotionally honest without being overwhelming. She had the words arranged. She opened her mouth and the words that came out were, "Yes." Jabari was quiet for a moment, then, "I thought so." "How long have you thought so?" "Since the airport." He picked up his chopsticks again. "He has my nose." "You have his nose," Kamari said, slightly faint. "Same thing." He ate a piece of rice. "Are you going to be together?" "I don't know." "That's honest." He considered. "Does he know? That I know?" "Not yet." Jabari nodded slowly, processing this. "You should tell him," he said. "He'll want to know I know." A pause. "He worries about things even when he doesn't show it. It's the same as when I worry. I can tell." Kamari looked at her 9-year-old son, who had identified a psychological pattern in a man he'd known for 10 days that she had taken 3 months to identify in Nairobi, and felt the specific, overwhelming mixture of love and helplessness and pride that was the daily emotional texture of raising this particular child. "I'll tell him," she said. "Good." He ate more rice. "Can I get the red bean dessert?" "Yes," she said. "Yes, you can." She told Do-hyun that evening in a brief call after Jabari was asleep. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough that she checked to see if the call had dropped. "He said that?" Do-hyun's voice was altered. Not broken. He didn't do broken, she was starting to understand. He did contained and then more contained, but altered. "He said you worry about things the same way he does." Another silence. "That's—" He stopped. "I know," she said. "Tell him—" He stopped again. "Tell him I'll see him tomorrow, if that's all right." "It's all right," she said. She ended the call and sat in the dark of the hotel room with Seoul glittering through the window and thought about 10 years and the arithmetic of choices and the specific cruelty of arriving at the right place a decade too late. She thought about a man who had made terrible choices and was trying with the specific stiff unfamiliarity of someone who had not been practiced in trying to do something worth doing. She didn't know what it meant yet. She wasn't going to decide tonight. What she did know, and what she fell asleep knowing, which was not peace but was something adjacent to it, was that her son had a father who already knew how he stood and how he thought and how he worried, and that this was not nothing. Outside, somewhere in Seoul, the city moved through its nighttime operations, and in a building in Gangnam, a man who controlled more of those operations than most people knew sat in the dark and held his phone and thought about a 9-year-old boy who had his nose and who had figured out the truth in an airport arrivals hall and sat with it patiently for 10 days and then simply said it out loud at dinner. Patient as water, patient as stone. Do-hyun sat with that and understood for the first time that his son was going to be. Do-hyun was there at 8 in the morning, not summoned, not invited with any specific warmth. Kamari had said it was all right, and he had treated that as a coordinate, a fixed point to navigate toward, and he showed up at the hotel with 2 paper cups of coffee from the place on the corner and stood in the lobby and waited. He didn't call ahead. Calling ahead gave people the opportunity to say no, and he was not yet confident enough in what was being built between them to risk a no over the phone. Jabari came out of the elevator before Kamari did. He saw Do-hyun, looked at the 2 cups of coffee, and said, "Did you bring one for me?" "I brought you orange juice." Do-hyun produced a bottle from his coat pocket. Jabari took it with the assessing nod of someone whose expectations had been met at a satisfactory level. "My mom told you I know," he said. "She did." "And?" Do-hyun looked at him. This 9-year-old standing in a hotel lobby holding a bottle of orange juice and waiting for an answer with the patience of someone who had decided the answer mattered and was therefore worth waiting for correctly. "And I'm glad you know," Do-hyun said. "I didn't want there to be things between us that weren't true." Jabari considered this with appropriate seriousness. "There are probably going to be things you don't tell me because you think I'm too young." "Probably. That's different from lying." "Yes," Do-hyun said. "It is." Jabari appeared to accept this philosophical distinction and opened his orange juice. Kamari stepped out of the elevator 30 seconds later, saw them standing together, and went very still for just a moment. A beat, barely perceptible, but Do-hyun caught it because he caught everything, before she continued walking toward them. She was in work clothes. Her face had the controlled composure of someone who had made a decision and was committed to the execution of it regardless of how the execution felt. She took the coffee he offered without comment. "Thank you." "He asked if I brought one for him," Do-hyun said. "I know." She looked at Jabari. "We talked about demanding things from people." "I didn't demand. I inquired." Jabari drank his orange juice. Something almost happened in Do-hyun's face again. Kamari saw it, looked away from it, drank her coffee. The morning moved the way the previous 10 days had moved, with a rhythm that had no official shape, but had nonetheless become familiar in the way that dangerous things became familiar, through repetition and the gradual erosion of the distance that familiarity required. They walked. Jabari had produced a list of things he wanted to see in Seoul before they left, organized by district and cross-referenced with public transit maps, and Do-hyun had spent 2 days quietly ensuring that certain locations on that list were accessible without the navigational complications that would otherwise arise from his presence in public spaces. He didn't explain this to Kamari. She noticed anyway. "You've arranged things," she said, while Jabari was absorbed in the window display of a shop in Insadong selling traditional paper crafts. "Some things. I don't need you to arrange things." "I know." He kept his eyes on Jabari. Jabari wanted to see Gyeongbokgung on Saturday. On Saturdays, there are tour groups that move through that corridor at 11. I've asked someone to check whether the eastern gate is less congested. Kamari was quiet for a moment. "You've asked someone?" "Yes." "Who?" He looked at her then. "Someone who works for me." She turned back to Jabari's reflection in the shop window, her jaw doing the thing it did when she was constructing and then rejecting sentences. "Do-hyun. I know. That's not... I need you to understand that I can't just..." She stopped. "He's 9. He doesn't know what you are. He knows you're his father, and he knows you know things, and he knows people seem to defer to you, and he has categorized all of this under interesting, because he's 9, and the world is still largely interesting to him rather than threatening. I need it to stay that way." Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to let anything threaten him." "That's not the point. The point is that he doesn't need to understand why nothing threatens him. He doesn't need to see the infrastructure." She turned to face him fully. "Can you do that? Can you be..." She pressed her mouth closed. "Can you be a person? Just a person. Not the other thing. When you're with him." Do-hyun looked at her with that directness that she still had no adequate defense against. "I can try," he said. And then, after a pause, "That's the honest answer." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "Honest is what I asked for." Jabari came out of the shop with a small piece of hanji paper folded into a crane and presented it to Do-hyun with the gravity of a formal transaction. "The woman showed me how," he said. "I made it for you." Do-hyun took it. He looked at it for a moment. Small, slightly imperfect, genuinely made, and put it in his jacket pocket with a care that was not performed. Kamari watched this and said nothing, and told herself that what she was feeling was still only the processing of old things. The message came at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. Kamari was at her desk in the Seocho office with the Sungon logistics documents spread in front of her and 3 screens open when her personal phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, a text came through from the same number. You are building something that belongs to people who do not appreciate architects. Stop now or we will find a more permanent way to slow your work. This is the first message. There will not be many. She stared at the text for 10 seconds. Then she photographed it, emailed the photograph to the collective security coordinator in Geneva, forwarded it to the Seoul police detective who was nominally assigned to case security, and put her phone face down on the desk and went back to the Sungon documents. This was procedure. She had procedure for this. She had been through it before, a case in Lagos, a case in Bangkok, both of which had produced threatening communications, and neither of which had produced actual violence against her person. The calculus was usually that lawyers were more useful threatened than harmed. Harmed lawyers attracted attention. Threatened lawyers sometimes stopped. She was not going to stop. What she was going to do was finish tracing the Sungon chain before anyone with operational intent had time to move their money somewhere she couldn't follow it. The threat was actually useful information. It meant she was close enough to something real that real people were feeling the pressure. She did not tell Do-hyun. She told herself this was because it was none of his business, which was true. She told herself it was because involving him would complicate the case, which was also true. She did not examine the third reason, which was that telling Do-hyun would trigger a response she was not sure she was prepared to manage. She was in the middle of a critical document when her colleague Min-ji appeared at her desk with an expression that meant news. The prosecutor's office called, Min-ji said. They want a meeting. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Kamari straightened. Which prosecutor? Yoon Chang-ho. Min-ji's voice had a specific texture. He's senior, very senior. He doesn't usually take meetings on ongoing investigations at this stage. Kamari thought about Do-hyun's source inside the prosecutor's office. She thought about information management. She thought about the particular feeling of having multiple forces operating around her that she could neither fully see nor fully control. I'll be there, she said. Kid. Prosecutor Yoon was in his late 50s, with the careful posture of a man who had been navigating institutional politics for long enough that his body had adapted to permanent diplomatic caution. He shook Kamari's hand across a desk that was too clean, the desk of a man who kept his real work somewhere else, and offered tea she didn't want. Ms. Omandi, he said, your reputation precedes you. I'd rather my work preceded me, she said. A slight smile, not warm. Of course. He folded his hands on the clean desk. Your investigation into the Meridian Network. We have been following your progress with interest. I was told you weren't aware of our investigative direction at this stage. We have resources, he said. The same phrasing Do-hyun had used. Kamari felt the coincidence land in her chest like a stone in water. Ms. Omandi, I want to speak plainly. Please. The Meridian Network has connections in this city that extend into areas of significant political and economic sensitivity. The financial trail you are pursuing, the Sungon chain, will, if followed to its end, implicate individuals whose cooperation we rely upon for other, larger matters. He paused. I am not asking you to stop. I am asking you to consider the value of a strategic pause. 3 months. We use that time to secure testimony from a cooperative witness we are currently cultivating. We then proceed with a prosecution that is cleaner, Kamari said, more comprehensive, less damaging to your political relationships. His smile didn't change. More likely to result in successful convictions. Kamari looked at him across the clean desk. She thought about 4,000 people. She thought about the text on her phone. She thought about a financial trail that was 3 weeks from being complete enough to be usable. I appreciate your candor, she said. My answer is no. The smile remained. I expected as much. I wanted it noted that the conversation occurred. He stood. Be careful, Ms. Omandi. This city has considerable respect for the rule of law. It also has considerable experience with the spaces between laws. She left without the tea. She called Do-hyun from the street outside the prosecutor's office. She had not planned to. She was standing on the pavement in the gray October morning, and she called him because the list of people she trusted in this city was very short, and he was on it, which was itself a problem she hadn't finished solving. He answered on the second ring. "Prosecutor Yoon just asked me to pause the investigation," she said without preamble. A silence. "When?" 10 minutes ago. What reason did he give? Political sensitivity? Larger interests? The standard architecture of obstruction dressed in institutional language. She was walking without direction, burning off the adrenaline. He also knows about the Sungun chain, which means your source in the prosecutor's office isn't the only crossover between your world and theirs. Yoon has his own relationships, Do-hyun said carefully. I'm aware of them. With the Meridian Network? A pause that was a fraction too long. With people adjacent to it. She stopped walking. Do-hyun. He's not complicit in the trafficking. He's complicit in the protection racket, different layer of the same structure. His voice was measured, and she could hear him choosing each word with the precision of someone navigating a documented minefield. He has received payments to ensure that certain investigations move slowly. And you know this because I know everything that happens in this city. Stop saying that like it's a neutral fact. The anger in her voice was sharper than she intended, and she let it be sharp because it was genuine, and she was done managing her genuine responses for his comfort. You know this because you operate in the same ecosystem. You know this because at some level, regardless of what you've done or not done with the trafficking network specifically, you are part of the structure that makes this possible. Silence. Am I wrong? She said. No, he said. You're not wrong. She stood on a sole pavement in the cold and breathed. What else do I need to know? What else is there that affects this case that you haven't told me? There's a man named Volkov, Do-hyun said. Dmitry Volkov. He runs the Eastern European side of the Meridian Network. He's been in Seoul for 6 days. I didn't tell you because I was trying to determine whether his presence was related to the network's operations or to you specifically. A pause. I now believe it's both. The cold air went colder. He's here because of my investigation. I believe so. And you waited 6 days to tell me this. I was verifying. Do-hyun. Her voice was completely flat. My son is in this city. The silence that followed had a different quality. Heavier. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you now. That's not... You don't get to make that calculation on my behalf. You don't get to decide what I know and when I know it based on your own timeline. That's the same thing you did 10 years ago. The words were out before she could stop them, and they were true, and they landed, and she didn't take them back. You decided what I needed to know. You decided when I was ready. You disappeared because you calculated it was the right thing for me, and you didn't give me the choice. His breathing was audible now. Controlled, but audible. You're right, he said. You're right, and I'm sorry. I don't need sorry right now. I need everything. I need every piece of information you have that is relevant to this case and to my safety and to Jabari's safety, all of it, now. A breath. Can you do that? Yes. Then I'll be at your office in 1 hour. She ended the call and stood on the pavement and let her hands shake for exactly 10 seconds, which was what she allowed herself, and then she put her phone in her pocket and started walking. Do-hyun's real office, not the investment firm's reception floors, but the actual room where actual decisions were made, was not what she had expected, and was exactly what she should have expected. It was spare. A table, chairs, a whiteboard with nothing on it, one window looking out at a building across the street. No art, no display. The room of someone who had never needed the environment to communicate power because the power communicated itself through other means. He was standing when she arrived. June let her in and disappeared. On the table were documents, physical documents, not digital. She noted this, noted what it implied about his security practices, spread in an organized pattern that she recognized as the architecture of someone who had been preparing this briefing before she called. He had been going to tell her, maybe not today, but soon. She filed that and didn't let it soften her. Sit down, she said, because she needed to be the one to set the terms of the room. He sat. She remained standing and looked at the documents. Volkov, she said. Do-hyun pointed to a photograph. A man in his 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the flattened face of someone who had absorbed violence professionally over a long period of time. Dmitry Volkov, former FSB, recruited into organized crime in the late 90s when the agency was bleeding personnel into the private sector. He built the Meridian Network's logistics infrastructure. Not the idea of it, but the mechanism. How it moves people, how it launders money, how it maintains operational security. He paused. He's methodical, not emotional. He doesn't threaten people for theatrical reasons. He threatens them because he's done the math and decided that a threat is the most efficient first step. He sent me a message, Kamari said. Do-hyun went still. When? Yesterday afternoon. I reported it to Geneva and to the police. The stillness had something new in it now. Not anger exactly, or not only anger, something that ran underneath the anger, older and more structural. What did it say? She told him. He listened without expression, and the absence of expression was itself a kind of expression, and she watched his hands, which were flat on the table, and watched the moment when they became slightly less flat. You should have told me immediately, he said. I am not obligated to tell you anything immediately. Her voice was steady. I handled it through appropriate channels. The appropriate channels include a police force that has at least 2 officers on Meridian's payroll and a prosecutor who takes payments to slow investigations. He said it without heat, just fact, delivered with the precision of someone who had mapped the corruption in this city the way a surveyor maps terrain. The appropriate channels are not appropriate here. So what is appropriate, she said. Your channels? Your people? Do-hyun, the moment I route my security through your organization, my case is compromised. Any evidence I've gathered becomes challengeable. Any conviction we get becomes vulnerable to appeal. She looked at him across the table. I am a lawyer. I cannot win this using your methods. I'm not asking you to win it using my methods. His voice was still controlled, but there was something beneath the control now, something that had been quiet for a long time and was running out of room. I'm asking you to let me keep you safe while you use yours. Those 2 things are not separable in the way you're describing. They can be. They cannot. She leaned forward. If Volkov is watching my investigation, he's watching everyone around me, including you, including the fact that I'm meeting with you. If that becomes known, if it becomes documentable, my entire case collapses under the weight of my association with a known criminal organization. Do-hyun was quiet. I know, she said. I know what that means, and I know it's not what you want to hear. But you asked me to be honest with you, and I'm being honest. You are a liability to this case. The same power that you want to use to protect me is the thing that could destroy everything I've built. The silence stretched. Outside, Seoul continued its operations. Somewhere in the building a phone rang and was answered and a door opened and closed. Then what do you want from me? He said. Very quiet. I want the information, she said. All of it. Everything you know about Volkov, about the network, about the financial chain. I'll use it to build a case through legitimate sources, and I'll find ways to document the trail that don't lead back to you. She straightened. And I want you to stay away from Jabari until this is over. The last sentence landed differently from everything else. She saw it. Kamari, I don't say that to hurt you. And she didn't. She said it because it was true and because she had a child, and the child was the fixed point around which every other calculation organized itself. I say it because if Volkov has identified me, he's identified my proximity to you. And if he's done the math on how to reach me most efficiently, the answer involves Jabari. I will not have my son used as leverage because I made the mistake of... She stopped. Because you trusted me, he said. She didn't answer, which was an answer. Do-hyun looked at her for a long time with his hands flat on the table and the document spread between them and the window behind him gray with the Seoul afternoon. Then he said, Tell me one thing. Honestly. What? If the case was finished, if Volkov was gone, if all of this was resolved. He held her gaze. Would you still want me to stay away? The room was very quiet. Kamari looked at the man across the table, the man who had left her, who had been wrong, who was trying in the specific stiff way of someone who had never learned to try, who crouched down to Jabari's level and adjusted his stance and put a paper crane in his jacket pocket with a care that was not performed. And she said, "I don't know." "That's the honest answer," he said. The same words he'd used to Jabari, patient as water, patient as stone. She gathered her copies of the documents and left. In the elevator going down, she let her forehead rest against the cool metal wall for exactly 5 seconds. Then she straightened and watched the floors descend and thought about Volkov in this city for 6 days and her son in a hotel on the other side of Seoul, and something that had been manageable dread became something else entirely. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Different number from the first message, but the same flat syntax, the same deliberate economy of threat. "We know about the boy." The elevator doors opened. Kamari stood in the lobby of Do-hyun's building and read the message twice and felt the floor of the world drop away beneath her feet, and understood with absolute and terrible clarity that this had just become something she could not handle. She was back through the lobby doors before the elevator had finished closing behind her. Do-hyun was still at the table when she came back through the office door without knocking. He looked up and read her face in the half-second before she spoke and was already standing. She held the phone out to him. He took it, read the message, read it again. The quality of his stillness changed. It was the same stillness she had seen in the airport, in the cafe, across the table 20 minutes ago, but this one had a different density to it, like something had been compressed to a point where compression was no longer possible, and the next thing that happened would not be stillness at all. "When did this come?" he said. 30 seconds ago. Lobby." He was already moving, phone out, calling someone. The conversation immediate and in Korean too fast for her to follow completely, but she caught enough. "Hotel. Now. The boy. 2 men. Don't move him. Confirm." He ended the call and made a second one before the first had fully disconnected, and she stood in the doorway and felt the specific terror of being in a situation where someone else's infrastructure was the only thing standing between her child and something she couldn't name yet. "My people are at the Shilla," he said. "Jabari is in the hotel. He hasn't left. He's with the tutor until 4. "I know." He was already at the door. "We need to move." "Do-hyun!" "Kamari." He turned. His face was the controlled face, the professional face, but underneath it something had cracked open that she recognized because she was feeling it too. The specific animal terror of a parent understanding that their child is in proximity to danger. "We can argue about everything else later. Right now I need you in my car, and I need us at that hotel in 15 minutes. Can you do that?" She could do that. She was already doing it. The car was a black Genesis with tinted windows and a driver who did not look at them in the mirror. Do-hyun sat beside her in the back seat and made 3 more calls she partially understood and partially didn't, and she sat with her hands in her lap and ran through the arithmetic of what she knew. Volkov had been in Seoul 6 days. He had sent the first message yesterday. He had sent the second message 30 seconds after she walked out of Do-hyun's building, which meant he had someone watching Do-hyun's building, which meant he knew about the meeting, which meant the association she had been trying to prevent was already documented. The case was compromised. She didn't know to what degree. That was a problem she would solve later. The immediate problem was her son. "How did they know where I was?" she said. Do-hyun was quiet for a half-second. "My building has external surveillance coverage. The footage is someone with the right access could pull it." "Who has that access?" Another half-second. Shorter than the first, but she noticed it. "Technically, several contractors." "Do-hyun, who has that access?" He looked at her. "I'm going to find out." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have right now that's true." His jaw was set in a way she recognized. Jabari's jaw, doing the same thing when he was processing something that required more room than he currently had. "Someone in my organization, or someone with access to my organization's systems, gave Volkov information. I don't know who yet. I will know." The car moved through Seoul traffic with the efficiency of a vehicle whose driver understood that certain passengers did not wait for lights in the conventional way. Kamari looked out the window at the city and thought about Jabari in the hotel room with his notebooks and his organized desk and his patient 9-year-old certainty that the world was a place of interesting problems rather than genuine threats. She thought about that certainty and what it would cost to preserve it. "When we get there," she said, "I go in first, alone." "Kamari, he's my son. I'm the one who walks through that door, and I'm the one who decides what he sees and what he doesn't see and what gets explained. Her voice did not shake. She was very focused on that. Your people can be in the building, but Jabari sees me first. Do-hyun looked at her for a moment and then nodded. One nod. Agreed. Well, Jabari was at his desk when she came through the hotel room door, a textbook open in front of him and a half-eaten apple at his elbow. The tutor, a young woman named Soo-yeon, who had proven admirably unflappable over 2 weeks, sitting across from him with a grammar worksheet. Both of them looked up. Kamari looked at her son, his face, his aliveness, the apple at his elbow. Ms. Omandi, Soo-yeon said. We're done for today, Kamari said. Thank you, Soo-yeon. I'll call the agency. Soo-yeon read the room with the instinct of a young woman who had learned to read rooms and gathered her things and was gone in under 2 minutes. Jabari watched his mother with the assessment face. What happened? He said. Nothing has happened. She sat on the edge of his bed, which put her at his level. I need us to move to a different hotel tonight. Why? Precaution. Jabari looked at her with those eyes. Is it because of your case? Yes. Is someone threatening you? She held his gaze. She had promised herself when he was born that she would not lie to him about danger, that she would calibrate what she told him to what he could carry, but she would not construct false safety for him, because children who were lied to about danger didn't learn to assess it. They learned to distrust the people who lied to them. There are people who don't want me to finish my work, she said. They've sent some messages. We're being careful. Jabari absorbed this. Does Do-hyun know? Yes. Is that why he has people in the lobby? Kamari went still. How do you know that? I went down for a snack at 2:30. There were 2 men near the elevator who weren't guests. They had the same way of standing that Do-hyun's people have. He said this completely without drama. I came back upstairs. She looked at her son, her 9-year-old son, who had identified Do-hyun's security personnel by their posture and come back upstairs without incident and returned to his textbook, and felt the mixture of pride and terror that was becoming the dominant emotional register of this trip. Pack what you need for tonight, she said. Just tonight. Don't take everything. He was already moving. The second hotel was smaller in a district Do-hyun knew, a place that did not appear on the standard booking platforms, the kind of arrangement that existed because certain people required discretion that the conventional hospitality industry could not provide. Kamari registered under a different name, using documentation that Do-hyun's people produced with an efficiency she chose not to examine. Jabari looked at the documentation process with the focused attention of a child filing information for later. She got him settled. He asked for the textbook he'd forgotten to pack, and she told him she'd get it tomorrow, and he accepted this with the grace of someone deciding that flexibility was the appropriate response to a situation he didn't fully understand. She sat on the edge of his bed until his breathing slowed, and then she went into the main room, and Do-hyun was there. She had not told him to be there. He was there anyway. She sat down across from him. Between them on the table were 2 cups of coffee that had been there long enough to be wrong temperature. Neither of them touched them. Tell me about the leak, she said. His face was doing the compressed thing again. He had been on his phone since the hotel, in and out of the room, conversations in Korean that she caught pieces of, names, mostly, cross-referenced against something, demands for information that were not requests. She had let him work. She recognized work when she saw it. His name is Ryu Tae-suk, Do-hyun said. He's been with my organization for 7 years, logistics coordinator. He had access to the building surveillance system through his administrative credentials. A pause. He also had access to a significant portion of our financial routing documentation. Had. He's in custody. My custody. She noted the distinction and its implications and moved past it. How long has he been feeding information to Volkov? Based on what we've pulled from his communications, 4 months. 4 months. She did the math. That predates my arrival. He was feeding them information about your operation generally. Yes, and when your name appeared in materials crossing my desk, he flagged it to them. Do-hyun's voice was flat and controlled, and under the control was something she recognized as the specific cold fury of a man who had been betrayed by someone he trusted with proximity. They knew you were coming to Seoul before you landed. Kamari sat with that. My investigation wasn't compromised by my association with you, she said slowly. I was already compromised. They were already watching. Yes. The first threatening message, the one yesterday, was triggered by your meeting with Yoon. They have a source in his office as well. He paused. The second message was triggered by your presence in my building, but they would have found another trigger. They were escalating regardless. She looked at the wrong temperature coffee. What does Ryu tell you about Volkov's operational intent? Volkov doesn't make idle threats. Do-hyun said it like a fact about weather. The messages are procedural for him. He documents that he gave warning before escalating. He'll have a timeline. How long? The pattern in his previous operations, Lagos 2019, Budapest 2021, is 48 hours between first warning and action. He met her eyes. The first message came yesterday at 14:17. She did the arithmetic. That's tomorrow afternoon. Yes. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building, something mechanical cycled on and then off. Jabari's breathing was audible through the thin wall. Slow, even. The breathing of a child who had packed what he needed for one night and gone to sleep with the adaptability of someone raised by a woman who did not show fear. I'm not going to stop the investigation, Kamari said. I know. That's not stubbornness. If I stop, the financial trail goes cold. Volkov's people move the money. Sungan dissolves. Everything I've built in 3 weeks disappears, and 4,000 people. She stopped. I'm not stopping. I know, he said again. So what I need from you... She pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at him directly. What I need is everything, not managed information, not things you're verifying, everything you know about Volkov's location, his people, his operation in Seoul, all of it, right now. Do-hyun looked at her for a moment, then he started talking. He talked for 40 minutes. She took notes on her phone, not because she was going to use his information directly, but because she needed to understand the shape of what she was inside. Volkov had 12 men in Seoul operating out of a logistics facility in Namdaemun that was nominally a freight forwarding company. He had a second location, a residential property in Mapo, that served as accommodation and planning space. His financial operations in Seoul were managed through 3 contact points, 2 of whom she had already identified in her Sungan research without knowing their affiliation. She was closer than she had understood. She was also more exposed than she had understood. There's something else, Do-hyun said. She looked up from her notes. His face had changed. Not the compressed fury face, not the controlled professional face. Something else. Something she had not seen before. Something that was closer to the face he'd made in the airport when he first saw Jabari. That brief, devastating unguardedness before the composure reassembled. Ryu gave them more than surveillance footage and schedule information. He paused. A pause with weight in it. He gave them the financial documentation that crosses my desk, including, 3 weeks ago, before you arrived, I had a report prepared, an internal assessment of the Meridian Network's Seoul operations, their vulnerabilities, their financial pressure points. He held her gaze. I had it prepared because I was already planning to help you, before the airport, before I knew you were coming. I had heard the collective was sending someone to Seoul, and I was preparing information. She waited. That report also contained, he said, a full accounting of my organization's financial relationships with every entity operating in our sphere, including entities that have, at various points, had contact with the Meridian Network, including the 2 sub-lieutenants who accepted the payment 18 months ago. He paused again. Volkov has that document. Kamari was very still. If that document is disclosed to the Korean prosecutor's office, Do-hyun said, it constitutes evidence of financial association between my organization and the Meridian Network. Not the full picture, not contextualized, but enough. He looked at her with eyes that were completely steady and completely exposed simultaneously, the look of someone delivering a sentence they have been composing for an hour and know will land badly. It also contains references to our meetings, the cafe, this hotel, the nature of the information I've provided you. The silence had a different texture now. He's going to use it, Kamari said. Yes, not to prosecute you, to destroy my case. She was working through it as she spoke, the lawyer's mind disassembling the mechanism. He submits that document to Yoon anonymously. Yoon uses it to argue that my investigation is compromised by association with an organized crime figure who had his own undisclosed interests in the Meridian network. Every piece of evidence I've gathered becomes challengeable. The Sung'an chain, the financial transfers, the shell company documentation, all of it tainted. She looked at him. My case doesn't just pause. It ends. And I face potential professional sanctions for the association. Yes, he said. When were you going to tell me this? When I confirmed it. I confirmed it 20 minutes ago. She stood up. The movement was not dramatic. She simply needed to not be sitting. She walked to the window and looked at the Seoul night and thought about 3 weeks of work and 4,000 people and a financial trail that was 3 weeks from completion and was now potentially already compromised. She thought about the fact that Do-hyun had prepared a report to help her before he knew she was coming, and that the existence of that help was the thing that was going to be used to destroy her. She thought about the fact that she had told him, specifically, that his involvement was a liability, that she had been right, that being right provided exactly zero comfort in this specific moment. Is there a version of this, she said to the window, where the document doesn't get to Yoon? There are several versions. His voice was careful. None of them are things you can be involved in. She turned. What does that mean? It means there are ways I can ensure the document doesn't reach the prosecutor's office that involve methods you cannot sanction, endorse, or know the details of. He said it plainly. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you there is a separation that is possible. You don't know, you don't ask, and your case continues. She looked at him across the room. You're asking me to accept something happening in the dark and not examine it? Yes. You understand what you're asking me? Yes. He held her gaze. I'm asking you to trust me with the part of this that belongs to my world, the way I've been trying to trust you with the part that belongs to yours. Kamari stood at the window and felt the full specific weight of where she was. A woman who had built her entire life and career on the principle that transparency and law were the only legitimate tools, standing in a safe house in Seoul, with her son asleep through the wall, being asked to look away while a man she was not sure she had stopped loving did something she was not sure she could live with knowing. She opened her mouth to answer. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it because she always answered unknown numbers on active cases, and because the reflex was faster than the dread. Ms. Omandi. A voice she didn't recognize, male, accented, Eastern European, completely conversational, the way certain kinds of dangerous people were conversational, comfortable with the weight of what they were saying because they had said similar things many times before. I hope the new hotel is comfortable. The room with the yellow lamp in the window, 3rd floor. Her blood went cold. They were outside. Right now. They could see the window. I want you to understand something, the voice continued, still conversational, still relaxed. I don't particularly want to hurt you. Lawyers who get hurt become martyrs, and martyrs complicate things. What I want is very simple. In the morning, you will contact your organization in Geneva and tell them that new information has come to light that requires you to withdraw from the Seoul investigation. You will recommend the case be reassigned. You will be on a flight to Nairobi within 48 hours. A pause. This is the last conversation. After this, there are no more messages. There is only whether you make the call or you don't. Kamari stood at the window and did not move and did not speak. Your son is a serious child, the voice said, very focused, reads a great deal. He was at the desk by the window for most of the afternoon. Another pause. 3rd floor of the previous hotel, of course. We haven't needed to look for you at the new one. Yet. The call ended. Kamari lowered the phone. She turned and looked at Do-hyun, and what was in her face was not the controlled face, was not the lawyer's face, was not any face she had constructed over 10 years of building a self that did not need saving. It was the face underneath all of those, the one she almost never let the surface see. And Do-hyun crossed the room to her in 3 steps, and she let him, which was itself a kind of collapse she had not budgeted for. He was watching Jabari, she said. Her voice was completely steady, and the steadiness was the most frightening thing in the room. He was watching him at the other hotel, before we moved. Do-hyun's hand was on her arm. She was aware of it distantly, the way you were aware of solid ground after a long time on water. He has eyes on this building, she said. I know. I heard. He had heard. The phone was not on speaker, but in the quiet of the room the voice had been audible, and she could see in his face that he had processed every word and had already moved past processing into the place where he lived professionally, the place where problems were solved with finality. Kamari, look at me. She looked at him. I need you to take Jabari and go to the room at the end of the hall. There is no window that faces the street. Stay there until I come for you. His voice was very quiet and very certain. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't say my name first. What are you going to do? What I do? He held her gaze for one more second, something in it that was not comfort exactly, but was the nearest available thing. And then he was moving, phone out, already calling, and the room was already different, the air in it compressed and purposeful, and moving towards something that the room at the end of the hall had one small window that faced an interior courtyard and a lock that Do-hyun had checked personally before he left. Kamari sat on the edge of the bed with Jabari beside her. She had woken him without explanation, just her hand on his shoulder and her voice saying his name, and he had come awake immediately and looked at her face and gotten up without asking questions, which was the thing about her son that simultaneously made her proudest and broke her heart most cleanly. He was sitting against the headboard now, with his knees pulled up, watching her. How bad? He said. I don't know yet. Is Do-hyun handling it? She looked at him. Yes. Jabari nodded. That single nod. Then he reached over and took her hand, not in the way a frightened child takes a parent's hand, but in the way someone offers ballast to a person they can see is working hard to stay level. His hand was small and warm, and she held it and stared at the door and listened to the building. From somewhere below, 2 floors, maybe 3, she heard a door open and close. Voices, brief, in Korean. Then nothing. Then her phone vibrated. Do-hyun, stay. She stayed. Maet. Do-hyun came back 47 minutes later. He knocked twice, said his name, and she opened the door. He was not visibly different. Same suit, same face, same controlled stillness, except that his collar was pulled slightly to one side and there was a mark on the back of his right hand that had not been there before. A scrape. Fresh. She looked at it and he looked at her looking at it, and neither of them said anything about it. Volkov's people had 2 vehicles on the street, he said. They're gone. Gone how? Gone in a way that will take them several hours to recover from. His voice was flat and operational. The building is clean. We have coverage on all approaches. For tonight, you're safe. And tomorrow, he sat down in the chair by the window, and for the first time since the phone call, she saw the exhaustion. Not the physical kind, though that was there too, but the kind that came from sustained high-level threat assessment, from running calculations about things that mattered more than operations. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor and said, Tomorrow, we need to move faster than Volkov moves. The document, she said. I have people working on it. He looked up at her. The copy Ryu passed to Volkov is on a physical drive. He hasn't transferred it electronically. Too traceable. He was going to hand it to a contact who would deliver it to Yoon's office in the morning. That contact is currently unavailable. Kamari looked at him. Unavailable. Having a difficult evening. He said it without emphasis. There are 2 other copies we know of. One is on Ryu's personal device, which is in my possession. One is in Volkov's secondary location in Mappo. A pause. The Mappo copy is the problem. Why? Because getting to it means going into a location where Volkov has 10 men, an operational infrastructure, and is currently aware that his evening has gone sideways. He held her gaze. He'll be expecting a move on Mappo. He'll have tightened everything. But you're going anyway, she said. Yes. With how many people? Enough. He said it the way he said most things about his operational decisions, with a completeness that signaled he was not going to provide detail because the detail was not something he was willing to have her carry. Jabari had fallen asleep again, sideways across the headboard, with the adaptability of a child who had learned that sleep was a resource to be claimed when available. Kamari watched his breathing for a moment and then looked back at Do-hyun. Come back, she said. It was not a request exactly. It was not a command. It was something between the two. The thing you said to someone when you had not yet resolved what they meant to you, but you knew with absolute certainty that their absence would be a specific and unacceptable kind of damage. Do-hyun looked at her for a moment with that unguarded thing moving in his face. Then he stood up and left. Cham. The Mapo location was a converted warehouse that had been partitioned internally into functional spaces. A coordination room, storage, accommodations for 8 men, and a secure room at the rear where Volkov worked when he was in Seoul. Do-hyun had the floor plans from a contact who had done electrical work on the building 18 months ago. He had studied them for 22 minutes in the car on the way over. He had memorized them the way he memorized everything that mattered, not by effort, but by the kind of focused necessity that made information permanent. He had 9 men. It was enough. It was going to have to be enough. They went in through the loading dock at the rear, which was the approach Volkov would expect least because it was the most structurally exposed. The logic of the unexpected was its own protection. Do-hyun moved through the dark of the loading dock with his shoulder against the wall, and June 2 steps behind him and the sounds of the building resolving into a map, footsteps on the floor above, a television somewhere, a door opening and closing in a rhythm that told him where the patrol route was and how long the intervals were. The first 2 men were in the stairwell. They were dealt with quickly and quietly, the way Do-hyun's people handled these situations, not with unnecessary violence, but with the specific efficiency of men who had done this enough times to remove the hesitation that made it messy. Do-hyun stepped over the second man and kept moving. The coordination room was on the second floor. 3 men, 2 laptops. One of Do-hyun's people went through the door at an angle, and the room was cleared in 11 seconds. One of the laptops had an external drive connected to it. Do-hyun pulled the drive without pausing to examine it and put it in his jacket pocket. Volkov, he said to June, rear room, 2 guards outside. They moved. The 2 guards outside Volkov's secure room were not the men Volkov used for standard logistics. They were the kind of men who ended up in this specific professional position because they had been selected for size, speed, and a particular relationship with pain that ran in the direction of inflicting it rather than experiencing it. Do-hyun registered this in the half-second before contact and adjusted his angle accordingly. The fight in the corridor lasted 40 seconds and was not clean. Do-hyun took a hit to the left side that was going to leave something significant under his shirt by morning. He felt the impact without fully processing it, the way you felt things in motion that you only understood at rest, and gave back worse than he received, which was the only arithmetic that mattered in corridors like this one. He came through the secure room door with his shoulder and his momentum, and Volkov was standing. The Russian was exactly what the photograph had suggested. Broad, flat-faced, the physical architecture of someone who had been in rooms like this one many times and had developed a relationship with them that was professional rather than frightened. He had a weapon in his hand, but Do-hyun had closed the distance fast enough that the weapon was a liability rather than an advantage, and he had it away from Volkov in 2 movements that cost him another hit, this one to the jaw, hard enough that his vision whitened for a half-second at the edges. He put Volkov against the wall with his forearm across the man's throat and his weight behind it, and breathed through the white at the edges of his vision until the white receded. Volkov looked at him with the professional calm of someone who had been in this position before and was calculating rather than panicking. His throat worked against Do-hyun's forearm. His hands were at his sides. Not reaching, not submitting, just waiting. "The document," Do-hyun said. His voice was level. His side was screaming. "Every copy, every transfer, every contact you've shared it with." "You got the drive," Volkov said. His Korean was accented but functional. "You think there's only one. I think you're going to tell me about the others. And if I don't?" Do-hyun looked at him. Volkov was reading his face the way experienced men in dangerous positions read faces, looking for the line, the place where the threat became performance, the calculation of how far this actually went. He found the line and what was on the other side of it, and something in his professional calm shifted register by a fraction. "There are 2 other copies," Volkov said. "One with my lawyer in Moscow, encrypted, on a remote server, accessible only to him and only if he doesn't receive a specific message from me every 72 hours. He paused. "You understand what that means?" Do-hyun understood what it meant. It meant the document was not retrievable. It meant Volkov had built a dead man's switch. It meant that the copy in Moscow existed in a place Do Hyun could not reach without creating an international situation that would collapse everything faster than the document itself. He kept his forearm across Volkov's throat and thought. "And the second," he said, "already transmitted." A pause. Volkov's flat eyes watching him. "1 hour ago, before your people hit the street. It's in a draft folder in an email account that my contact in Yoon's office will access tomorrow morning." A slight shift in the professional calm, not a smile exactly, but the expression of someone who has played a move they are confident about. "You can take the drive. It changes nothing." Do Hyun stood with his forearm across Volkov's throat in a room in Mapo at 3 in the morning and understood that the operation had solved part of the problem and left the other part exactly where it was. The document was going to Yoon. Kamari's case was going to be challenged. Whatever happened next was going to happen in daylight, in offices, in the institutional architecture of a legal system that he could influence at the margins but could not control. And the only person who could navigate that architecture was Kamari. And Kamari had been placed in this position because of him. He removed his forearm from Volkov's throat and stepped back. Volkov straightened, looked at him. "You're not going to—" "If Jabari Omandi or Kamari Omandi is touched," Do Hyun said, "in any way, by any person connected to your organization or acting on your instruction, the conversation we're having right now will be the most comfortable experience of the rest of your time in Seoul." He said it without heat. That's not a threat. It's a logistical fact. Are we clear? Volkov looked at him for a moment. Then, "The woman should stop her investigation. The woman will make her own decisions." Do Hyun picked up the external drive from the floor where it had fallen during the fight. "Your people on the street tonight. Make sure they understand the same thing I just told you." He walked out of the room. In the corridor, June fell into step beside him, and they moved back through the building and out through the loading dock into the Seoul night, and Do Hyun walked with his side on fire, and his jaw aching and the drive in his pocket, and the particular weight of a man who has resolved one problem only to find the real problem was never the one he'd been solving. He was back at the safe house by 4:15. He had changed his shirt. June had anticipated this with the practicality of someone who had been anticipating Do Hyun's needs in these situations for 6 years. But the movement of changing had told him the left side was cracked, possibly, or bruised deeply enough to behave like cracked, and he was managing it with the same dissociation he applied to most physical damage. Acknowledge, file, continue. Kamari was in the main room. She had not slept. She was at the table with her laptop open and her legal pad beside it, and she looked up when he came through the door and read him the way she had been reading him for 3 weeks. Quickly, accurately, with the particular attention of someone who had learned his tells against her own intention. Her eyes went to the line of his jaw, the shirt, the way he was holding his left side without obviously holding it. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine." "Sit down, Do Hyun." He sat. She went to the bathroom and came back with a towel and the first aid kit that was standard equipment in every space his people maintained, and she sat across from him and looked at his jaw and then said, "Take off your shirt." "Kamari, I am not doing this as anything other than practical assessment. Take off your shirt." He did. The bruising on his left side was the color of a storm front, deep purple already spreading toward black at the center, covering the lower 3 ribs. She looked at it without expression, pressed 2 fingers gently at the edge of it, and he controlled his reaction to that with the effort it deserved. "Breathe normally," she said. He breathed normally, or as normally as the situation permitted. "Not cracked," she said, "deeply bruised. You need ice, and you need to not do anything requiring core stability for 48 hours. She sat back, which I understand is probably optimistic given current circumstances. "The drive is clean," he said. 2 other copies, one in Moscow, dead man's switch, inaccessible. One already transmitted to a contact in Yoon's office, accessible in the morning. She was quiet while he told her the rest of it. She didn't interrupt. She made 2 notes on her legal pad, which meant she was already building the response architecture. He watched her face move through the information, processing, discarding, reconstructing, with the particular quality of attention that a person brought to a problem they had decided they were going to solve regardless of what the solution cost them. Yoon's office gets the document in the morning, she said. Yes. And the document links my investigation to your organization. Yes. But the document also contains, she said slowly, your own detailed financial analysis of the Meridian network, including their pressure points, including the 2 payments your sub-lieutenants accepted 18 months ago, and the fact that you terminated that relationship and returned the money. She looked at him. If the document goes to Yoon, it exposes me, but it also exposes them, the network's full soul financial structure, corroborated by your internal analysis. She paused. That's not only a problem. That's also evidence. Do-hyun looked at her. If I can get to Yoon before his contact delivers the document, she said, if I can present the document to him myself, not as something being used against me, but as something I'm submitting as part of my case, it changes the frame entirely. I'm not the subject of the disclosure. I'm the source of it. She was moving through the logic quickly now, the lawyer's mind finding the angles. The association between my investigation and your organization becomes documented cooperation rather than undisclosed compromise. It's still complicated. It's still going to draw scrutiny, but it doesn't end the case. It reframes it. You'd be walking into Yoon's office and handing him documentation that includes my name, Do-hyun said. Yes. Voluntarily. Yes. He looked at her. That exposes me to prosecution. It exposes certain financial activities to scrutiny, she said carefully. The terminated payment, the knowledge of network operations. It's complicated, Do-hyun. I won't pretend it isn't, but it's less damaging than Volkov's framing, and it's the truth. A documented version of the truth. She held his gaze. I told you I needed you to use your power to help rather than harm. This is what that looks like. It doesn't look comfortable. The room was very still. Do-hyun sat with his ruined side and his aching jaw and looked at the woman across from him, the woman who had spent 3 weeks with his information, his interference, his complicated presence in her case, and who had arrived at a solution that was specifically designed to use every piece of that interference as forward momentum rather than obstruction, who had taken the thing that was supposed to destroy her and found the angle at which it became a weapon. You'd need to be at Yoon's office before 8, he said. Yes. His contact delivers at 8:30, based on what you told me about their communication pattern. Then I need to be there at 7:45. He was quiet for a moment. I'll have a car for you at 7. She nodded. Then she looked at him, at the bruising, at the jaw, at the controlled exhaustion, and said, You need to sleep. You need to sleep. Her voice was not soft. It was the voice of someone who had made a decision and was delivering its terms. 2 hours. The chair. I'll wake you at 6:30. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he leaned back in the chair carefully with the specific deliberateness of a man managing a damaged side and closed his eyes. Kamari turned back to her laptop and her legal pad and worked in the small light of the safe house while Seoul moved through the last hours of its night. And at some point in the hour before dawn, she looked up from her notes and looked at him sleeping in the chair. The tension partially released from his face in sleep, the paper crane from Jabari's hand still in his jacket pocket where it had been since Insadong. And she held that image for exactly as long as she permitted herself before she looked back at her work. At 6:15, before she woke him, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't know. She opened it. A photograph. Low light, slightly blurred, taken from outside a window. The interior of the safe house main room. Do-hyun in the chair, her at the table. Taken within the last 2 hours. And beneath the photograph, 4 words. Last chance. The boy. She was still staring at it when Jabari's door opened. He stood in the doorway in his socks and his sleep-wrinkled shirt, blinking, and then he focused on her face and said, Mom. And then from somewhere below the building, barely audibles, the sound from below the building was a door, a service entrance, metal, the kind that rang when it opened fast against its frame. Then footsteps, multiple, moving with purpose, not the measured pace of building staff. Do-hyun was awake before Kamari could reach him, not startled awake, present awake, the kind of waking that bypassed grogginess entirely, because somewhere in his nervous system, the architecture of alertness never fully powered down. He was on his feet in one movement, his hand already at the phone in his pocket. and he read Kamari's face and then the phone in her hand, and she turned the screen toward him. The photograph. The 4 words. He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he crossed to Jabari in the doorway, crouched down, and said, "I need you to do exactly what I say, right now." Jabari looked at him with clear eyes and said, "Okay." Bathroom. Lock the door. Don't open it until your mother's voice. Jabari looked at his mother. She nodded once. He went, without running, without panic, with the particular focused calm of a child who had understood for several days that the situation had real weight and had been waiting to be given something useful to do with that understanding. The bathroom door closed and the lock turned. Do-hyun straightened and was already calling June when the stairwell door at the end of the hall opened. 2 men. Not Volkov's standard logistics personnel. These were the other kind, the kind that got selected for specific purposes. The first one was inside the hall before Do-hyun had the phone to his ear, and the second was 3 steps behind him, and the distance between them and the safe house room was 15 feet in closing. Do-hyun moved toward them. Not away. Toward. Kamari understood the logic in the half-second she had to understand it. The room was behind him, the bathroom was behind her, Jabari was behind the bathroom door, and every foot of distance Do-hyun could create between the threat and that door was a foot that mattered. She stepped back against the bathroom door and braced her feet and became what she needed to be, which was the last thing standing between her son and anyone who reached her. The fight in the hallway was brutal and fast, and not the kind of thing that had choreography. Do-hyun took the first man at full momentum, inside his reach, and what followed was the kind of close-quarters violence that was less about skill than about willingness. The willingness to absorb impact in order to deliver it, to accept damage in the service of outcome. His side screamed. He ignored it in the way he had been ignoring it since Mappo, the way you ignored a fire in a room you needed to pass through. The second man got past him. Not far. 4 steps. Kamari hit him with her elbow at the angle of his jaw. Not a trained strike, a desperate accurate one, the kind that landed because desperation had better geometry than training, and the impact bought 3 seconds in which Do-hyun got his arm around the man's neck from behind, and the 3 seconds became enough. The hallway was quiet. Do-hyun was breathing hard. His left side had moved from screaming to something past screaming, something that had become a sustained white frequency he was operating behind. He stood in the hallway and looked at Kamari, and she looked at him. And they were both breathing, and the morning light was starting at the end of the corridor, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Mom," Jabari's voice calm through the bathroom door. "Is it done?" Kamari leaned her forehead against the door for 1 second. 1 second only. Then she straightened. "Yes, baby. Come out." The lock turned. June arrived 7 minutes later with 2 additional men and the information that Volkov had moved his remaining Seoul personnel in the last hour, consolidating, pulling back to the freight facility in Namdaemun. Do-hyun listened to this and made 3 decisions in the time it took to listen. First, Kamari and Jabari were moving again now to a location that had not been used for anything connected to this situation. Second, the freight facility needed to be addressed before Yoon's office opened. Third, he was going to do the second thing himself because the alternative was sending men into a situation he hadn't scouted on the strength of information that was 6 hours old, and that was the kind of arithmetic that produced the wrong answer. He told Kamari the first decision. She looked at him, and then at Jabari, and then back at him. "And you," she said. "I have something to finish." Do-hyun, Kamari. He said her name the way he had said it in Nairobi, 10 years ago, the handful of times he had used it as its own complete sentence. "I need you to be at Yoon's office at 7:45, with the document, everything we discussed." He held her eyes. "Can you do that?" She looked at him for a long moment, at the jaw, the side he was holding with one arm now, without attempting to conceal it, the controlled exhaustion that was past the point of control, and said, "You have to come back." "I know." "That's not a preference. That's a condition." Something moved through his face. "I understand the terms," he said. And then, because it was true, and because he was done managing what was true, "Jabari needs his father to come back, and I need—" He stopped. The sentence had more in it than he was going to say in a hallway at 6 in the morning with his side broken and his son watching from the bathroom doorway. I'll be there. Jabari walked up to him and hugged him. Not the hesitant hug of a child still calibrating, the full committed hug of someone who had made a decision about what this person meant and was acting on it. Do-hyun's hand came up and held the back of his son's head, and his eyes closed for exactly 3 seconds, and then he straightened and June was at the end of the corridor, and they moved. Oh, the freight facility in Namdaemun was a working building. Trucks in the loading yard, legitimate staff arriving for the early shift. The kind of operational cover that Volkov maintained with the discipline of someone who had survived in this profession for 20 years by making his business indistinguishable from the ordinary machinery of commerce. Do-hyun arrived with 6 men at 6:42 and went in through the office entrance because the office entrance was where Volkov would be, and Volkov was the only conversation that mattered. The facility was thinned out. Volkov had pulled his people back but not replaced them, which meant he was in a defensive posture, minimizing exposure, preparing an exit. Do-hyun moved through the building with the floor plan he had memorized from the structural files his people had pulled overnight, and found Volkov in the rear office with 2 men and a laptop and luggage that said he had already decided Seoul was finished. The 2 men were removed from the room with the efficiency that Do-hyun's people had demonstrated consistently across a very long night. Volkov looked at Do-hyun across the desk and read the situation and said, "You look terrible." "The document," Do-hyun said. "The contact in Yoon's office. You're going to call them. Right now. You're going to tell them the delivery is canceled." "And why would I do that?" "Because Kamari Omandi is walking into Yoon's office in 1 hour with the full document herself. Every page. Including your network's financial structure. Including the shell company chain. Including everything the document contains about my organization, which I am prepared to address through appropriate channels." He held Volkov's gaze. "Your play was to use the document to destroy her case. If she submits it herself, you lose that. The document becomes her evidence, not your weapon." Volkov was quiet for a moment. The professional calm was operating, calculating. "She's prepared to expose your financials voluntarily." "Yes." That's a slight pause. "That's not a move I expected." "I know." Do-hyun looked at him steadily. "Make the call. Cancel the delivery. Take your people and leave Seoul. The network's financial operations in Korea are over regardless. The prosecution is going to happen with or without your interference, and continuing to operate here is now more expensive than it's worth. You're asking me to walk away from 4 years of infrastructure. I'm telling you that the alternative is that I dismantle it piece by piece while the Korean prosecutors build a case from the documentation Kamari submits this morning, and you spend the next 18 months managing an international prosecution from whichever jurisdiction you run to." Do-hyun paused. "You're a practical man. Run the numbers." Volkov looked at him for a long time. Then he picked up his phone. The call lasted 90 seconds. When it was done, Volkov set the phone on the desk and said, "The delivery is canceled. My contact will not be in that office this morning." "The Moscow copy," Do-hyun said. "The dead man's switch." "Remains where it is. It's insurance, not a weapon, if your lawyer submits the document herself." Volkov closed the laptop. "We're done in Seoul. You have my word on that for whatever it's worth." "It's worth exactly what it costs you to break it," Do-hyun said. "We both know what that cost is." He left Volkov to his luggage and his exit and walked back through the freight facility into the early morning light of Namdaemun with his side burning and his jaw aching and the particular exhaustion of a man who had been running on the wrong kind of fuel for 20 hours and had arrived, finally, at the place where the running stopped. He called Kamari. "It's done. Go." Prosecutor Yoon arrived at his office at 7:50 and found Kamari Omandi already in the waiting area with a document folder and an expression that said she had been there long enough to have formed opinions about the quality of the institutional coffee. His assistant looked apologetic. Yoon looked at Kamari and read what was in her face and said, "Come in." She put the folder on his desk. "This is the complete version of the document your office was going to receive this morning from an anonymous source," she said. "I'm submitting it myself. Voluntarily. With full disclosure of every contact and information source it references." She sat down across from him without being invited to. "The financial chain connecting Sung'an Logistics to the Meridian network is complete and documented. The shell company structure is mapped. The laundering mechanism is here. She opened the folder and placed 3 pages in front of him. This is sufficient for prosecution under financial crime statutes. The trafficking evidence, properly handled, is sufficient for additional charges. Yoon looked at the pages. He looked at her. The references to Park Do-hyun's organization are fully disclosed, contextualized, and documented. His organization's contact with the Meridian Network consisted of 2 unauthorized payments made by sub-lieutenants, subsequently terminated and returned upon his knowledge. His organization has cooperated with my investigation by providing financial intelligence that has been independently verified through legitimate sources. She held Yoon's gaze. I am aware of how that association looks. I am asking you to read what it actually was. Yoon was quiet for a long moment. He turned the pages. She let him read without speaking, which was the hardest discipline in a room like this one. The resistance of the urge to fill silence with argument, to trust the document to do what documents did when they were correct. There will be questions about your methodology, he said finally. I expect them. The association with Park Do-hyun will be examined. I expect that too. This could complicate your standing with the collective. I'm aware. She met his eyes. Do you want to prosecute the Meridian Network or not? He looked at her for one more moment. Then he picked up his desk phone. Get me the financial crimes unit, he said. Yes, now, Shab. She was outside by 8:45. The morning had opened into thin, pale sunlight, the kind Seoul produced in autumn as an occasional concession to warmth, and she stood on the pavement with her empty document folder and her coat, and the particular feeling of someone who has put everything they had into a room and left it there, and now has to wait to find out what it becomes. Do-hyun was across the street. He was leaning against a car with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw showing the bruising now, a deep charcoal mark that would be worse tomorrow. And he was watching her with the stillness that she had been cataloging for 3 weeks and still found she had not fully indexed. When she crossed the street, he looked at her face and read it the way he read everything she showed him, quickly, accurately, without asking for more than she was giving. Done, she said. How did he respond? He made a call. Financial crimes. He's moving. She exhaled. It's not over. There's going to be scrutiny. There are going to be questions about my methodology and the association, and I'm going to have to answer all of them. But the case is alive. She looked at him. The case is alive. He nodded, that single nod. She looked at the bruising on his jaw and said, Where is Jabari? 2 blocks. With June. He ate 3 rice balls for breakfast and delivered a comprehensive summary of the failures of Volkov's operational security based on what he had observed over the past 12 hours. Kamari looked at the Seoul sky. Of course he did. He's not wrong, Do-hyun said. The assessment was accurate. She made a sound that was approximately a laugh, and not quite. The sound of a person arriving at the far side of something they weren't sure they were going to clear. Then she looked at him. At the man in front of her, damaged and exhausted and present. The man who had left and come back and left a paper crane in his pocket and crouched down to her son's level and put himself between her family and a corridor full of things that wanted to hurt them. And she said, I need to say something. Okay. I have been. I've been very disciplined about what I let myself feel about you. For 3 weeks and for 10 years before that. She looked at him steadily. I've told myself it was professional. That it was about protecting Jabari, that I was managing an old complication with appropriate detachment. A breath. I was lying to myself. I've been doing it for a long time, and I'm very good at it, and I'm choosing to stop. Do-hyun was very still. I'm not forgiving you, she said. I want to be clear about that. What you did, disappearing, choosing for me, leaving me with a pregnancy and a life I rebuilt from the ground up without you, I'm not putting a line through that and calling it resolved. It happened. It cost me things I'm not sure I can fully account for. She held his gaze. But I am, she stopped, organized. I am choosing to be in the same place as you, going forward, whatever that means and wherever it goes and at whatever pace it goes. I'm choosing to be present for it instead of managing it from behind glass. Do-hyun looked at her for a long moment. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be honest about that. I know how to run an organization. I know how to solve problems with finality. I know how to protect people and make decisions and manage situations that most people would not be able to manage. A pause. I don't know how to be a partner. I don't know how to be a father in the daily sense, the ordinary sense. I've been learning in 3-week increments, and I understand that's not sufficient. I know, she said. I'm going to make mistakes. I know that too. What I am is not going to change entirely. I can change the way I use it. I have been changing the way I use it, but the infrastructure doesn't disappear. I know what you are, she said. I've known for 3 weeks. I submitted a document this morning that documented it to a Korean prosecutor. I am not under any illusions. She looked at him. I'm also not going to pretend that what you did last night was nothing, that what you've been doing for 3 weeks is nothing. Jabari has a father who knows how he stands and how he thinks and how he worries. That's not nothing, Do-hyun. That is not nothing. He looked at her, and the unguarded thing was in his face fully now. No composition over it. No professional stillness managing it. The face of someone who had been carrying a weight for 10 years and had just been told that the ground could hold it. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced, slightly battered from the night but intact, the paper crane that Jabari had made in the shop in Insadong. He held it out to her. She took it and looked at it. I carried it through Mapo, he said, through the freight facility. He stopped. I wanted something that was his when it was... He stopped again. She looked at the small, imperfect crane in her palm and then up at him, and then, because she was done with the glass and done with the management and done with the disciplined distance, she stepped forward and put her arms around him carefully, minding his side, and he stood very still for one moment in the way of someone who had not been held without strategy for a very long time, and then his arms came around her and they stood on the pavement in the thin soul autumn sunlight, and she felt him exhale, a long, deep exhale, the kind that had been waiting for years for the right place to land. Yeah. Jabari came around the corner with June 2 steps behind him, assessed the situation in front of him with the clear eyes of a child who had known this was coming, and said, "Finally." Kamari laughed against Do-hyun's shoulder, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't produced in several days. She stepped back and looked at her son. I have opinions about the timeline, Jabari said, walking toward them. But I'm choosing not to share them right now because contextual awareness is important. I appreciate that, Do-hyun said. Jabari stopped in front of them and looked at Do-hyun with the assessment face, and then at the bruising on his jaw with the specific scrutiny of someone conducting a damage report. Does it hurt? Yes. Does it hurt more than you're saying? A pause. Yes. Jabari nodded, satisfied with the honesty. You should eat something. You look like you've been awake for 30 hours. 28. That's worse, not better. He turned to Kamari. Can we get breakfast? I've been thinking about the place with the egg toast for 3 days. Kamari looked at her son, her 9-year-old son who had spent a night in a safe house bathroom and emerged to critique a man's physical condition and advocate for egg toast, and felt the specific particular love that had no adequate language, the love that was also terror and also exhaustion and also the deepest available form of gratitude, all of it at once, all of it always. Yes, she said. We can get breakfast. They left Seoul on a Thursday morning, 11 days later than scheduled. The delay was the prosecutors. The financial crimes unit had moved faster than anyone expected. The Sungon chain had collapsed inward like a building whose supports had been removed cleanly, and 4 arrests had been made in the first week, 2 more in the second. The document Kamari had submitted to Yoon was now part of the official case record. The questions about methodology had been asked and answered, and the association with Do-hyun's organization had been examined and documented and classified as a disclosed cooperation rather than an undisclosed conflict of interest, which was exactly the framing she had walked into Yoon's office to establish. It had cost her something. There were people in the collective who were uncomfortable with the association, who would continue to be uncomfortable with it, and she was going to have to manage that discomfort for a period of time she couldn't yet quantify. That was the price of the side door. She had known it when she opened it. She paid it without complaint because 4,000 people was still the number, and the number still required consequence. And the consequence was now moving through the legal system of the Republic of Korea with the particular unstoppable momentum of documented financial evidence in the hands of prosecutors who had decided to use it. The trafficking network's sole operations were over. Volkov was gone. Belgrade, according to Do Hyun's intelligence, and facing separate legal pressure from European authorities who had been building their own case for longer than Kamari, had been in Seoul. The dead man's switch in Moscow remained where it was, inert now, a document about a situation that had already been disclosed, its power as a weapon spent. The morning of their departure, Do Hyun came to the hotel, the original Shilla to which they had returned after the safe house. The disruption absorbed by Jabari as another entry in the catalog of interesting experiences, and he sat at the edge of Jabari's bed while Jabari packed with the meticulous organization of a child who categorized his belongings by frequency of use, and he did not say much. He handed Jabari things that needed to be packed. He answered questions about whether certain books would survive the flight in a carry-on or needed to be in checked luggage. He tied the crane to the outside of Jabari's backpack using a piece of cord, attaching it through the tail so it would travel with him. Jabari looked at the crane on his backpack and then at Do Hyun and said, "You're coming to visit?" "Yes." "When?" "6 weeks. I'll come to Nairobi." Jabari considered this timeline with the seriousness it deserved. "That's acceptable," he said. "There are things I want to show you." "I know." Do Hyun looked at his son. "I want to see all of them." Jabari returned to packing with the decisiveness of someone who has received adequate information and is now processing it into plans. Do Hyun stood and went into the main room where Kamari was doing the final pass for forgotten items, the specific spatial check of a traveler who has done this enough times to have developed a protocol for it. She found a notebook under the bed that Jabari had missed and set it on top of his bag without comment. Then she straightened and looked at Do Hyun. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. And after that? And after that, we figure out what after that looks like. He held her gaze. 1 day at a time. No promises I can't keep. No disappearing. He paused. I don't know what the shape of this is going to be, but I know I'm not going to make the same choice I made in Nairobi. I'm done making that choice. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to him and put her hand on his face, carefully, on the undamaged side, and looked at him the way she hadn't let herself look at him in 10 years. Without the glass, without the management, with the full weight of what was true. I know who you are, she said. I'm not asking you to be different. I'm asking you to be present. There's a difference. I know the difference, he said. Prove it, she said. 6 weeks at a time. He put his hand over hers. They stood like that in the hotel room in Seoul, while Jabari zipped his bag in the next room and the city moved through its Thursday morning outside the window. And it was not a resolution exactly. It was more honest than a resolution, which was that they were two people who had found each other again in the wreckage of choices that could not be undone, and were choosing, with full knowledge of the cost, to stand in the same place and see what could be built from what remained. The flight left at noon. Jabari had the window seat and spent the first hour watching Seoul diminish below the clouds with the focused attention of someone committing it to memory, and then he opened his book and read for 2 hours with the concentration of a child who could be entirely elsewhere when the material was sufficient. Kamari sat beside him with her case notes and her legal pad and did not work. She looked out the window at the cloud cover over the yellow sea and thought about the shape of what was ahead, the scrutiny, the ongoing case, the 6 weeks, the conversation that was still being built sentence by sentence between a woman who had learned to do everything alone and a man who was learning, in the specific stiff way of someone who had never practiced it, that presence was a different skill from protection. She thought about what Jabari had said at the hotel desk in the first week. He worries about things the same way I do. She thought about the paper crane tied to a small backpack in the overhead compartment, traveling from Seoul to Nairobi, made by her son's hands in a paper shop in Insadong on a Sunday afternoon that had been ordinary in the way that certain ordinary things turned out to contain the whole weight of what mattered. She thought about 10 years and the arithmetic of choices and what it meant to choose not to close the account. Jabari looked up from his book. Are you working? No. He looked at her assessment face, the one she recognized now because it was also Do Hyun's face, the face of someone cataloging and deciding. Then he said, good, and went back to his book. She looked out the window. Below the clouds, far below, the sea moved in its own continuous arithmetic, indifferent and vast, patient as it had always been, carrying the weight of everything that passed over it without record or remainder. She let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like 3 weeks and possibly 10 years. Outside, the light was clear, and the altitude was enough that you could see where the sky began to curve, barely, at the very edge of what the eye could reach, that far threshold where distance became something else entirely. Not an ending, but a change in kind, the place where the visible world folded into what came next. She turned back to her son. He was reading, entirely absorbed, the crane swaying almost imperceptibly in the overhead compartment above them with the movement of the aircraft, and she watched him read and thought, "This is what remains." After the violence and the choices and the paper trails and the corridors and the things that cost more than you budgeted for and the things you thought you had closed and found instead that you had only set aside, this is what remains. A boy reading a book at 30,000 feet. A man 6 weeks away learning to practice presence. A case moving through a foreign legal system towards something that was not justice exactly. Justice was too clean a word for the outcomes available in a world this complicated, but was consequence, which was the nearest approximation and would have to be enough. She opened her legal pad. Not to work. To write one line, which she wrote in the margin, in the handwriting she used for things she intended to keep. The price was real. The remainder is real. Both are true. She capped her pen. Jabari turned a page. The plane carried them south toward the continent where she had been born and where her son had grown up, and where, in 6 weeks, a man with a paper crane in his jacket pocket would land for the first time and stand in an unfamiliar city and begin the long, unglamorous daily work of being present. It was not the story she had planned. It was considerably more expensive than the story she had planned. It had cost her sleep and professional standing and the carefully maintained certainty that she did not need anyone to stand between her and the things that wanted to reach her. What it had given her was harder to name, not safety. She was not naive enough to call it safety. Not resolution. She had submitted too many documents to too many offices to believe in clean endings. What it had given her was the specific texture of a life that was being lived rather than managed, with all the damage and all the weight that living rather than managing required. She looked at her son's profile in the window light. She thought, enough. She thought, yes. She thought this.